The billion-dollar contract lay exposed on the polished desk, its pages gleaming under the office lights. Adrian Cole sat motionless in his chair, eyes half closed, as the 19-year-old intern stepped in and froze at the sight. In that breathless moment, he faced the biggest temptation of his life, and his next decision would expose his true character. Adrian Cole was 50 years old and at the peak of his empire. What had begun as a small software company 2 decades earlier had grown under his leadership into a global corporation, shaping the digital infrastructure of entire nations. His face appeared regularly on magazine covers. His name alone could move markets. And in the corporate world, his presence commanded both respect and fear. Yet behind the controlled smile and immaculate suits lived a man hollowed out by betrayal. Only 6 months earlier, the partner he trusted most had stolen sensitive technology and sold it to a rival conglomerate. The scandal cost billions, and worse, it shattered Adrian's belief in loyalty. He convinced himself that honesty was nothing more than a story people told when the stakes were low, and that once real temptation arrived, every human being would reveal the same greed. Far from this world of wealth and power was Ethan Reed, 19 years old, a scholarship student struggling to balance lectures with part-time jobs. He was the first in his family to attend college, and every step he took inside the skyscrapers of cold dynamics felt unreal. He arrived each day in clothes that looked out of place against the tailored suits of executives, carrying with him both humility and determination. He delivered reports, fetched coffee, and recorded meeting notes that no one would ever read. To most employees, he was invisible, a boy who would come and go without leaving a trace. But Adrian noticed him, not because Ethan stood out with brilliance or ambition, but precisely because he seemed ordinary, unguarded, and free of pretension. To Adrian, Ethan was a mirror of the world he no longer trusted. If a boy like this, untouched by privilege, failed when temptation crossed his path, then Adrian's last fragment of faith in people would be extinguished. The CEO devised his test with cold precision. He would leave a contract capable of shaking markets openly exposed on his desk. Then he would recline in his chair and pretend to sleep. In that carefully staged silence, he would watch, waiting to see whether honesty still existed or whether greed would once again prove universal. The following evening, Adrian prepared his office exactly as he had planned. The envelope containing the contract was left slightly ajar on the polished surface of his desk, the pages fanned just enough to display the weight of what they contained. Outside the windows, the city glowed with countless lights, but inside the room, there was only silence. Adrian leaned back, his posture relaxed, his eyes half closed, as if he had drifted to sleep. Every detail was calculated to appear natural, while in truth, he was acutely aware of every sound. Ethan entered quietly, holding a stack of documents he had been told to deliver. His steps faltered the moment he noticed the envelope. The bold word, "confidential," printed across the top, made his pulse quicken. For a long moment he stood frozen, his mind spinning with possibilities he dared not articulate. He knew that files like these could contain agreements worth billions, secrets that competitors would kill to obtain. He looked toward Adrian, who appeared to be resting, unbothered, unaware. The temptation was real and crushing. Ethan's hands trembled as he placed the documents he carried on a side table. He stepped closer to the desk, his eyes fixed on the scattered pages. Any photograph, any single sheet slipped discreetly into his folder, and his life could change forever. Adrian waited silently, every heartbeat measured, expecting disappointment once again. But Ethan did not steal. He gathered the loose pages carefully, aligning them into neat stacks, slid them back into the envelope, and searched the office for a safer place. His eyes landed on a cabinet near the wall. The key was still in the lock. He placed the contract inside, turned the key until it clicked, and returned to the desk. On a small notepad, he wrote a brief message, explaining that he had found the file unsecured and locked it away to ensure its safety. Then he quietly left the room. When the door closed, Adrian opened his eyes. His gaze moved from the locked cabinet to the folded note resting on his desk. For the first time in years, a sharp certainty pierced through the cynicism that had ruled his thoughts. Against all expectation, the boy had resisted temptation. Perhaps, Adrian thought, honesty had not vanished entirely from the world. In the days that followed, Adrian found himself watching Ethan more closely. He noticed how the young man arrived early, staying long after others had left, how he carried out even the smallest tasks with an attentiveness that spoke of quiet pride. There was no arrogance, no sense of entitlement, only a steady effort to learn and contribute. For the first time in many months, Adrian felt curiosity replacing cynicism. Yet while Adrian observed in silence, another pair of eyes watched Ethan with growing hostility. Richard Kane, vice president of operations, had built his career less on ability than on inheritance. The son of a wealthy industrialist, he had always assumed that the company belonged to men like him. To see a 19-year-old intern from a modest background draw even a flicker of the CEO's attention ignited a venomous jealousy. Richard thrived on hierarchy, on keeping people in their places, and Ethan's presence seemed to him a dangerous threat. One evening after a board meeting, Richard lingered behind, his tone deliberately casual as he addressed Adrian. Why spend your time noticing a boy like that? Give him a glimpse of power, and he will soon imagine he belongs here. His words carried a sneer, laced with the arrogance of privilege. Adrian did not reply. He merely regarded Richard with a silence that felt heavier than words. But Richard read in that silence a challenge he could not endure. Later that night, when Ethan carried a stack of binders down the hallway, Richard stepped from the shadows to block his path. The corridor was empty, the glow of a single overhead light stretching their figures against the wall. "Listen carefully," Richard said, his voice low and sharp. "Men like you do not last here. You may think the CEO sees something in you, but this world does not change. You will keep your head down, do what you were told, and when your time is up, you will disappear. Do you understand me?" Ethan gripped the binders tighter, his throat dry. "I am only here to learn, sir," he answered, his voice quiet but steady. Richard's smile twisted into something cruel. "Then learn your place. One mistake is all it will take to end you." What Richard did not realize was that Adrian, returning late from the garage, had paused in the shadows at the end of the corridor. He had witnessed every word. The anger that stirred in him was unlike the bitterness of betrayal he had known before. This was not about lost profits or stolen secrets. This was about a man abusing his power to crush a boy whose only crime was honesty. For Adrian, it marked a turning point. Richard had crossed a line that could not be ignored. Richard Kane was not a man who forgot a slight. The moment he saw the faintest sign that Adrian might favor the intern, resentment burned into obsession. He told himself that he was defending the company from naivety, but the truth was simpler and uglier. He could not allow someone like Ethan to exist in the same space that had always belonged to men like him. The boy's integrity was an insult to his cynicism, and the only way to erase it was through destruction. His plan took shape quickly. If Ethan's honesty had impressed the CEO, then Richard would paint him as dishonest. All he needed was the appearance of misconduct. With his authority, he had access to confidential documents, contracts, and prototypes that could be twisted into traps. A misplaced file here, a planted drive there, and the boy would stand condemned without ever raising a hand against himself. The first attempt was subtle. Late one night, Richard summoned Ethan with a fabricated errand, sending him across the building with stacks of files, while he slipped a restricted document into the intern's messenger bag. The next morning during a senior meeting, Richard strode in holding the file aloft. "Gentlemen," he announced, "we have a security breach. This was found in the possession of an intern." His gaze lingered on Ethan, whose wide eyes betrayed shock more than guilt. Murmurs swept through the room. Suspicion, doubt, judgment, all directed at a boy too stunned to speak. Ethan tried to protest, but his words stumbled. "I did not take it. I swear, I do not know how it got there." The board members exchanged wary looks. Adrian, however, sat perfectly still. His expression revealed nothing, but inside his mind every piece of the puzzle aligned. He had seen Richard's growing hostility. He remembered the threats in the hallway. This was not chance. What Richard did not know was that Adrian had already instructed his security team to keep records of activity in sensitive areas. The cameras Richard had once approved to intimidate employees now tracked his every move. Every entry into Ethan's office, every suspicious gesture in the corridors was being logged. Adrian said nothing in that meeting, allowing Richard to believe he had planted the seed of ruin. But behind the silence lay a different resolve. If Richard wished to play this game, Adrian would let him dig his own grave one scheme at a time. Richard's first attempt did not destroy Ethan as he had hoped, but it did plant suspicion. He saw the glances exchanged among the executives, the hushed whispers in the corridors, and he felt encouraged. If one seed of doubt could shake the boy's footing, then a second and a third would topple him completely. Richard had grown up manipulating people and believed no truth could survive the weight of repeated lies. A week later, he tried again. This time, he intercepted Ethan on his way to the archives, insisting that he deliver a set of sealed folders to the finance department. Ethan, eager to please, agreed without hesitation. What he did not realize was that Richard had slipped into those folders a confidential spreadsheet containing projected acquisitions worth billions. Hours later, Richard burst into the finance office with witnesses in tow, demanding to know why an intern was carrying such sensitive material. The accusation was sharp and public. Ethan stammered, insisting he had only followed instructions, but Richard's voice carried the authority of a vice president. He painted the boy as reckless, untrustworthy, and dangerously careless. Ethan left the office pale, the whispers behind him cutting deeper than any blade. That evening, Adrian reviewed the footage his security team had compiled. On the screen, he watched Richard slip the spreadsheet into the folders, his smirk clear as he closed the cover. Adrian's jaw tightened, but he did not yet intervene. Instead, he called Marcus Chen, a former investigator who had once helped him during a corporate espionage case. "I need everything on Richard Kane," Adrian said. "Every call, every message, every step he takes." Marcus understood immediately. "Leave it to me. Men like him always leave a trail." Meanwhile, Richard pressed harder. He spoke to the human resources director, claiming that Ethan's presence disrupted workflow. He suggested the boy lingered in restricted areas. He even hinted that Ethan had tried to curry favor with Adrian through manipulation. Each lie was delivered with the ease of a man accustomed to being believed. One night, Richard confronted Ethan directly in the underground parking lot. "You do not belong here," he hissed, stepping close enough that the boy could smell the alcohol on his breath. "I know how to end people like you. You will not survive another week." Ethan tried to stand his ground, but fear shook his voice. "Sir, I only want to work and learn. I have done nothing wrong." Richard's laugh echoed cruelly off the concrete walls. "Doing nothing wrong will not save you." What Richard did not know was that every word had been caught by the microphones Adrian had ordered installed days earlier. The system Richard once used as a weapon against subordinates had become the very net closing around him. Adrian listened to the recording later that night, his anger cold and controlled. He knew then that the moment was approaching. Richard was building toward one decisive strike, And when it came, Adrian intended to be ready. Richard believed he had cornered his prey. The whispers were spreading. The interns avoided Ethan in the cafeteria, and even some mid-level managers began to doubt his innocence. To Richard, this was the perfect stage for his grand finale. If the boy was branded a thief in front of the entire company, no explanation would save him. He would walk out humiliated, and Adrian would finally abandon the ridiculous idea that someone like Ethan could ever belong in a world of power. The trap was simple but devastating. Richard purchased a prototype chip, a device so valuable that its loss could cripple a project worth billions. On a quiet Tuesday evening, when only a skeleton crew remained in the building, he slipped the chip into Ethan's backpack while the boy was in the break room. Moments later, he summoned 2 security officers and several executives under the pretense of a routine inspection. They found Ethan at his workstation, typing up reports. Richard's voice carried false authority as he said, "We have reason to believe there has been a breach. Open your bag." Confused, Ethan complied, his hands trembling as the officers unzipped the backpack and revealed the small metallic case containing the chip. Gasps echoed through the room. Ethan's face drained of color. "I do not know how that got there," he stammered, his voice breaking. "I swear I have never seen it before." Richard seized the moment, his tone sharp and triumphant. "This is theft, a prototype worth billions in the hands of an intern." He looked directly at Adrian, who had arrived silently at the doorway. "This is the kind of danger I warned you about. People like him cannot resist temptation." The room fell into tense silence. Ethan's eyes filled with panic as he turned toward Adrian. "Sir, please, you have to believe me." "I did not do this. I have never betrayed your trust." His words tumbled out desperately, but doubt hung heavy in the air. For an instant it seemed Richard had won, but then Adrian stepped forward, his expression calm, his voice steady. "Before we make accusations, let us examine all the facts," he signaled to the security team, and within seconds, a screen flickered to life on the wall. Video footage rolled, grainy but unmistakable. It showed Richard entering the workspace minutes before, glancing over his shoulder, and slipping the metallic case into Ethan's bag. The angle was clear, the act undeniable. A second clip from another camera captured him bragging on his phone, saying the boy would never recover from what was coming. The executives turned in stunned silence. Ethan's breath caught, relief and disbelief flooding his face. Richard staggered back, his complexion pale, his words faltering. "That is not what it looks like," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Adrian regarded him with icy calm. "It looks exactly like what it is. A deliberate attempt to destroy an innocent man." What Richard did not realize was that this had been Adrian's plan all along. He had allowed the vice president to tighten his own noose, recording every attempt, every lie, every abuse. And now, with the evidence displayed before the entire board, Richard's downfall had begun. The board was summoned the following morning. Every director of Coal Dynamics sat in the conference hall, their faces grim as the footage played across the giant screen. They watched Richard plant the prototype, watched him whisper into his phone about framing Ethan, and listened to the audio recordings in which he admitted his intentions. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the crackle of the speakers. Richard sat at the far end of the table, his posture rigid, his eyes darting from face to face, as though searching for an ally. For years, his last name and family fortune had shielded him from consequence, but now those shields crumbled. Adrian stood at the head of the table, his voice calm but firm. "This company cannot and will not be a place where power is abused to destroy the innocent. Richard Kane has betrayed not only a young man's trust, but the integrity of this entire organization." One by one, the directors spoke, their tones sharp, their verdict unanimous. Richard was stripped of his position, his shares frozen pending investigation, and his immediate removal ordered. The announcement was delivered without ceremony, but the finality of it rang through the hall like a verdict from a court. Richard lurched to his feet, his composure collapsing. "You cannot do this," he shouted, his voice cracking. "My family will not allow it. We built this company. You think you can erase me?" Adrian met his outburst with steady eyes. "Your family has already been informed. They have chosen to distance themselves from your actions. The press will have the recordings by tonight." "You are finished, Richard." Security guards stepped forward. Cameras flashed as journalists who had been invited discreetly to witness the session began documenting every detail. The spectacle of Richard's fall was no longer hidden. It would spread across headlines, a public lesson in arrogance and corruption. As the guards guided him from the room, he struggled against their grip, shouting empty threats that only deepened his humiliation. In the corner, Ethan sat frozen, hardly able to believe what had unfolded. Only hours earlier, he had stood accused of theft, his future crumbling. Now he was vindicated before the highest ranks of the company. Adrian placed a hand on his shoulder and spoke quietly enough for only him to hear. "You stood firm when every lie rose against you. That is something no power can manufacture." Ethan swallowed hard, emotion tightening his throat. "Thank you, sir. I thought my life was over." Adrian's expression softened for the first time in years. "It is only beginning." The news spread like fire. By evening, every major network carried the story of Richard Kane's downfall. Clips of him being escorted from the boardroom played alongside the recordings of his threats and schemes. Analysts spoke of the arrogance of privilege, of how corruption rots a company from within, and of how integrity, once revealed, could dismantle even the most carefully guarded power. Richard's family issued a swift statement condemning his actions, distancing themselves from the disgrace that had shattered their name. For Richard, the consequences came swiftly and without mercy. His accounts were frozen, his resignation forced into the headlines, and his once formidable network of allies evaporated overnight. Within weeks, his wife filed for divorce, taking with her their children who refused to speak his name. Colleagues he had bullied for years publicly shared their stories, each testimony adding to the ruin of his reputation. By the time the investigation concluded, Richard was facing not only social exile, but also legal charges for corporate misconduct and attempted fraud. While Richard's empire crumbled, Ethan's life transformed in ways he could barely comprehend. At first, he struggled to believe that Adrian's trust was genuine. He kept waiting to be cast aside, for suspicion to return. But instead, Adrian drew him closer. He invited Ethan into strategy meetings, asked for his thoughts on projects, and treated him not as a disposable intern, but as someone whose perspective mattered. The boy who once fetched coffee now sat in conference rooms where the future of industries was debated. Adrian, too, was changed. The man who had lived in suspicion since his betrayal found himself remembering that moment in the office when Ethan locked away the contract and left the note behind. That simple gesture had reignited a faith he thought lost forever. In Ethan, he saw not only honesty, but the possibility of rebuilding a company on principles that went deeper than profit. Months later, Ethan stood in the atrium of Coal Dynamics as the CEO introduced a new initiative. It was a program designed to open doors for students from ordinary families, scholarships, and internships that would allow talent to rise regardless of background. Standing on the stage, Adrian gestured toward Ethan. This program was inspired by one of our own. Proof that integrity can thrive where least expected, and that when we nurture it, it can change the world. The applause thundered through the hall. Ethan felt his chest tighten with emotion. He had once been invisible in these corridors. Now his story was the foundation of something greater than himself. 3 years passed, and the memory of Richard Kane's downfall had become a case study in business schools across the country. His name was no longer spoken with respect, but with derision, a cautionary tale of how arrogance and abuse of power can destroy an empire built over generations. After serving a brief prison sentence for corporate misconduct, he was released into a world that no longer welcomed him. No reputable firm would hire him. Former colleagues avoided his calls. His children had changed their last name, and his ex-wife had remarried, leaving him alone in a small rented apartment. To survive, he sold used cars at a suburban dealership, earning less in a year than he once spent on a single dinner. Each time a potential employer or customer searched his name, the same articles resurfaced, reminding everyone of the scandal he could never escape. Ethan's world, however, had transformed in ways he once thought impossible. He completed his degree with distinction while continuing to work under Adrian's mentorship. By the time he turned 22, he was no longer an intern, but a junior executive trusted with major projects. His humility remained unchanged, but his voice had grown steady with confidence. Employees who once overlooked him now sought his advice. At industry events, his presence drew curiosity, for everyone knew the story of the boy who had chosen honesty when the stakes were highest. Adrian, now older, but with a renewed fire, often reflected on how a simple test had changed the course of his life. He had built programs that opened doors for hundreds of students like Ethan, ensuring that no talent would be wasted simply because of birth or circumstance. His company won awards for innovation and ethics, praised as a model of how corporations could succeed without sacrificing integrity. One evening, at a dinner to celebrate the company's new scholarship fund, Ethan stood before a crowd of executives, students, and journalists. He spoke not about himself, but about the lesson that had carried him through. Integrity is not about never being tested. It is about choosing what is right when no one expects you to. That choice changed my life, and it saved this company from a lie. In a quiet corner of a bar across the city, Richard watched the broadcast on a flickering television. His glass of whiskey trembled slightly in his hand. On the screen, Ethan spoke with conviction, the hall behind him filled with applause. Richard turned away, the weight of regret pressing down like a chain he could never break. Meanwhile, Adrian, seated beside Ethan on the stage, felt a rare peace. He had once believed betrayal had destroyed his ability to trust. Now he knew that trust, when placed wisely, could build legacies that outlived scandal and greed. 10 years later, Coal Dynamics had become a global symbol of innovation balanced with integrity. Its headquarters no longer represented only the triumph of technology, but also the triumph of values that had been tested in fire. The halls, once lined with portraits of past executives, now displayed stories of scholarship students who had risen to leadership. Among them, the most celebrated was Ethan Reed. At 29, he was no longer the uncertain boy who once delivered coffee. He was a rising executive, known for his sharp mind and unshakable principles. Journalists often asked him about the day he had discovered the contract on Adrian's desk. He always answered with humility, "I did what I believed was right. Anyone should have done the same." But those who knew the story understood that few would have resisted temptation as he did. Adrian, now approaching retirement, remained as chairman of the board. His once guarded heart had softened. He often introduced Ethan as proof that trust was not extinct, that honesty was not a relic of the past. Watching the young man step into roles of responsibility filled him with a sense of pride that no profit margin could equal. In Ethan, he saw the future, and in that future, the company he had built would endure beyond his years. Richard Kane's name had long since vanished from the company records. After years of drifting between meaningless jobs, he lived alone in a small town where no one cared about his past wealth. His disgrace remained immortal on the internet, an eternal reminder of the day he was exposed. Students studying ethics quoted his story as an example of arrogance undone by its own cruelty. His downfall had become his only legacy. On the evening of the company's 50th anniversary, Adrian stood on stage beside Ethan to announce a new fund dedicated to supporting young innovators from disadvantaged backgrounds. The audience rose in applause as Adrian placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Years ago, I thought integrity was gone," he said, his voice steady but touched with emotion. "Then one young man proved me wrong." Ethan looked out at the crowd, his mind briefly flashing back to that night in the office, the envelope, the choice that had seemed so small but had changed everything. He felt the weight of it still, not as a burden, but as a reminder of what honesty could build. In that moment, the contrast was complete. One man's deceit had led him to ruin, while another's honesty had built a legacy. True justice was never about vengeance or punishment. It was about showing that integrity, once defended, could inspire generations. And as the applause thundered, Adrian and Ethan knew that their story would live far beyond them, a lasting testament that when tested by temptation, the choice to do what is right can alter the fate of countless lives.